warriors of the western seas. We are the slayers of the Scots. Let no man fear death by the sword, for it is more honourable to die in the heat of battle than to grow fat in the complacency of peace. He whose life is taken in blood shall be born to Valhalla and the breast of the Valkyries to live in eternal glory. Odin and our gods protect us. We are invincible!
The Vikings were a fearless people, driven by a belief that death in battle would bring them everlasting glory. They crossed dangerous seas and fought against the bravest of the brave in other lands. In search of new lands and power, they came to Scotland. Lacking good farmland at home, they came first to gather plunder, but then to plough the land and gather the harvest. Many settled here. For hundreds of years, their descendants remained living under the lordship of the kings of Norway. Their first recorded attack in Scotland was on the holy Isle of Iona in the year 795. These raids and attacks continued over the next 500 years until they'd taken over Orkney, Shetland, West Highlands, Hebrides, all the islands including Arran and the Cumbries. The Scots fought back. Under King Alexander II, they began to regain control over some areas. In the year 1262, his 21-year-old son, Alexander III, attacked the occupying enemy with brutal force and regained the Western Isles from Norwegian control. News of these defeats was brought to the Norwegian king Haakon III. Determined to take revenge on the Scots, he led a mighty fleet of longboats over to Scotland, first to Orkney. Joined there by local forces, he sailed down through the Hebrides, gathering more and more Norse vessels on the way. When he eventually reached the Clyde estuary, his fleet consisted of 160 longships, manned by an estimated 15,000 Vikings. He was determined to reoccupy his lost Scottish territories and to reassert his power and strength. He moored his fleet at Arran, just off the coast of Lamlash. Here he met with King Alexander's envoys to negotiate a peace treaty. The envoys were ferried back and forth to Ayr, where King Alexander was based. Negotiations dragged on as each king argued over the terms. King Alexander's strategy was to play for time, much to the frustration of King Haakon. Eventually, Haakon's patience ran out and he launched an attack, sending 60 ships up Loch Long to Arica, raiding and pillaging as they went. The Norwegians then dragged their ships 1.5 miles across land to Tarbet at Loch Lomond, plundering all the towns and villages of the loch. Finally, they came via the River Leven to Dumbarton and attacked the castle. Meanwhile, the bulk of King Haakon's fleet was still moored at Arran, but not for long. King Alexander expected to face an imminent attack on the west coast. He had been waiting in Ayr with most of his army, but took the precaution of placing troops at strategic intervals all along the coast as far north as Largs. King Alexander had been playing a very anxious waiting game. He knew that an open naval battle was completely out of the question. His army was no match for Haakon's enormous fleet. All he could do was pray for divine intervention. His prayers were answered in the form of an almighty storm. His delaying tactics had paid off. On October the 2nd, 1263, King Haakon found himself caught between a rock and a hard place. Too late to head home, and with the storm fast approaching, he decided to move his fleet closer to the mainland, within the shelter of the Cumbria Islands. His plan failed. When the storm hit, it did more damage to his fleet than Scottish forces ever could. Dashed and broken on the rocks, his ships were scattered as far down the coast as Seamill and Ardrossan. Most of them ended up wrecked at Broomfields in Largs, near to where the Pencil Monument is now. That violent storm with hail and tempest is commemorated in this extract from a skaldic poem of the Scandinavian Middle Ages. The sorcery-strengthened hailstorm blew around the battle-eager men on the troop-inhabited surf skis of the surging sea, driven the very vigorous crew with war shields towards the shores of Scotland. The Norwegians suspected that the storms were caused by Scottish witchcraft, but the defenders needed no magic to help them attack the distressed ships, among them the vessel of King Haakon himself. Although Haakon's ship was designed to withstand stormy weather, conditions on the Clyde that night were worse than anything he had previously experienced. His stranded supply ships, too, were plundered by the Scots, leaving the Vikings very short of provisions. As the weather improved a little, Haakon sent forces ashore, causing the Scots to retreat up country. Haakon then landed himself, just as the Scottish army reappeared in such numbers that Haakon assumed that Alexander himself must be present. That was not the case. Alexander seems to have remained in Ayr. The Norwegians urged their king to rejoin the main fleet in order to command more of his forces to come ashore. He hesitated to do so, but reluctantly agreed. In the battle that followed, it was estimated that 800 or 900 Norwegians, including 60 from the king's own ship, were involved. According to some accounts, the Scots had 500 cavalry and 1,500 foot soldiers. This must have been an exaggeration, because the Scottish foot soldiers were mainly drawn from local militia in the surrounding towns and countryside. Nevertheless, the Vikings were estimated to be greatly outnumbered. As the battle raged, the weather howled, preventing Haakon from landing the rest of his army. Eventually, one of his commanders succeeded in rowing ashore to restore some order. Gradually, others joined him, and the Scots began to give way. For 3 days, the advantage swung back and forth between the Scots and the Vikings. Eventually, the Vikings were overcome and driven back into the sea, never to return. According to legend, it was a thistle that turned the tide of battle in favour of the Scots. It was reported that the Norsemen came upon a group of Scottish warriors. Planning to attack them under the cover of darkness, the Vikings took off their footwear to creep up on the unsuspecting Scots. However, the ground was covered in thistles, and as they crept towards their prey, one of the advancing Vikings stood on a thistle. He screamed out in pain. Instantly alerted to their presence, the Scots escaped the ambush and defeated the invaders. Although there is no historic evidence that this happened, it's a good tale. In 1470, the Thistle was adopted by King James III as the national emblem of Scotland, 1 year after the Norwegians abandoned their claim to Orkney and Shetland. And still to this day, it continues to stand proud as Scotland's emblem. It was here in Largs in 1263 that the last ever battle against the Vikings in Britain was fought. The Battle of Largs brought nearly 500 years of Viking occupation to an end. The death of King Haakon in Orkney on his way home to Norway sealed the Scottish victory. So, at the Peace Treaty of Perth in 1266, the Norwegians agreed to give up all claims to the Western Isles in return for 4,000 marks. In 1281, King Haakon's grandson Eric, on succeeding to the throne of Norway, married Margaret, the daughter of the Scottish King Alexander III. Another royal marriage in 1469 between Scots King James III and Margaret of Denmark ended Scandinavian claims to Orkney and Shetlands. However, the Vikings did not leave after that. Rather, they integrated themselves into the new culture and religion of Scotland. As John Donne the poet observed, "No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main." History shows that no nation stands alone, unaffected by other nations. The Vikings came to Scotland as pirates and plunderers, destructive forces of Odin and Thor. But many remained here to live and work in peace and to make their own unique contribution to Scottish culture. The Battle of Largs may have ended political dominance of the Vikings in Scotland, but their influence on Scottish life will always endure.